I'm Nima Rajan. International Olympic Committee President Thomas Bach officially closed the Tokyo Games, telling athletes that for the first time since the pandemic began, the entire world came together. He said that in these difficult times, the athletes gave the world the most precious gift of hope. The world's greatest athlete, decathlete Damian Warner of London, Ontario, carried the Canadian flag into the closing ceremonies.
You know, when things got closed down in Canada, it was tough, but I was lucky enough to have a community come together in London, Ontario, and support me. But that didn't mean that there wasn't tough times. And I kind of leaned on my coach, leaned on my family and the community that I had, and they pushed me through. And when you finally get to go out there and compete and kind of live your dreams that you've had, and you think back on how you got there, it makes it that much more special. So I think that the struggle that we went through definitely made these games that much more special.
Canada powered through the Games, winning 24 medals, which is the most of any non-boycotted summer games. The Games ended on a golden note with cyclist Kelsey Mitchell of Sherwood Park, Alberta, winning in the women's sprint. Well, for the first time in 17 months, non-essential American citizens and permanent residents are allowed to cross the land border into Canada, provided they are fully vaccinated with a Health Canada-approved COVID-19 vaccine. However, it's still unknown when Canadians will be allowed to drive into the U.S. for vaccinations or vacations, rather. Those crossing into Canada must still follow strict entry requirements, including showing proof of a negative molecular test for COVID-19 that's no more than 72 hours old, and also using the ArriveCan app or online web portal to upload their vaccination details. Canada's border agents have a tentative agreement with the federal government. They began a Work to Rule campaign this past Friday, leaving long lines of semi-trailers and passenger vehicles idling for hours at some of the country's busiest international gateways. The deal was announced after more than 36 straight hours of mediated talks. While other provinces may not agree with Quebec's decision to impose a vaccine passport system, the move appears to have support from the Canadian business community. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce says vaccine passports or digital vaccination certificates would help to prevent future waves of the pandemic from forcing a resurgence of COVID lockdowns by enabling those with low risk to participate in events and go about their daily lives. The Canadian Forces National Investigation Service has ended a nearly 6-month probe into the conduct of Admiral Art MacDonald. Its decision that there is not enough evidence to lay charges paves the way for Admiral MacDonald to return to his position as commander of the Canadian Armed Forces. The nature of the allegation against Admiral MacDonald has not been publicly confirmed. Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan isn't commenting on whether Admiral MacDonald will be reinstated as Chief of the Defense Staff. The chief of a Nova Scotia First Nation has issued an appeal ahead of the provincial election for Indigenous peoples' treaty rights to be recognized. Chief Mike Sack of the Sabaga-Nagadi First Nation says all levels of government must recognize Indigenous fishing rights to help lift the community out of poverty. August 9th is the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. About 280 wildfires are still burning across BC, including several that cover hundreds of kilometers. Officials are warning of aggressive fire behavior later this week at the 557 square kilometer White Rock Lake fire, which is burning between Kamloops and Okanagan Lake, as temperatures rise with no precipitation in the forecast. Cineplex, Canada's largest film exhibitor, has announced plans to launch a monthly subscription program that offers a small selection of perks and discounts at the multiplex. CineClub will cost nearly $10 per month and give members a free movie every month, along with cheaper member price tickets and a 20% discount on concession items. The CineClub membership program arrives on Wednesday. 2 Halifax universities are joining a growing list of post-secondary schools in Atlantic Canada, offering free tuition to students who spent time in foster care. Dalhousie University and the University of King's College says the new tuition waiver program helps remove financial barriers and encourage former youth in care to seek higher education. The Halifax schools join a growing number of universities and colleges in the 4 Atlantic provinces that are eliminating tuition fees for current or former foster children. A year after the COVID-19 pandemic forced the cancellation of most Indigenous events, the Montreal First Peoples Festival is back. Until August 11th, the 31st edition of the event will showcase a series of local music, dance shows, and more than 60 movies competing for the festival's Matusi Awards. All right, stay with us. Up next, we examine the #1 reason behind Canada's housing affordability crisis and what Canadians can do about it. An interview with Tristin Hopper, columnist at the National Post, coming up next. And then, of course, we'll have more news from around the world only on the Forum Daily. So stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back after these short messages. The current state of Canada's housing market has put young Canadians in a position where it's nearly impossible for many of them to purchase their own homes. But there may be a relatively easy fix to this issue. According to recent numbers from Demographia's rankings of housing affordability, Canadian housing is more priced out from its own markets compared to America, Britain, and even Singapore. The reason behind this disparity is the fact that Canada has fewer homes per capita than any other country in the G7. According to Tristin Hopper's recent column in the National Post, this is actually, surprisingly, an easy problem to fix. It just requires willpower. To tell us more, Mr. Hopper joins us now on Forum Daily. Sir, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Now, what are the main takeaways from Demographia's rankings of housing affordability when it comes to the Canadian housing market?
It's not much different than what we already knew. So, I mean, there's any number of reports we can look at. I mean, we know that housing is unaffordable in Vancouver and Toronto, and it has been for quite some time and is only getting more unaffordable with the recent dramatic price spikes, particularly at the tail end of COVID. So, I guess, yeah, Demographia is showing that not only are we more unaffordable than we've ever been in our history, it's starting to become, it's a rate of unaffordability that even looks weird by the standards of other large cities known for not having affordable real estate.
And you're saying the reason behind this disparity in your column is that it's because Canada's number of homes per capita is fewer than other countries. So why is Canada's housing market set up like this?
Yeah, basically, it's a constrained supply. So, I mean, real estate is no different than any other commodity. If you don't have enough around of it, the price goes up. So, we saw that with lumber. For instance, there wasn't a lot of lumber. It got really expensive. And then you made more lumber, and now it's not as expensive. But we have an artificially constrained supply in Canada because essentially most municipalities have very strict zoning laws that prohibit densification. So if you just had a normal unrestricted market, houses get really expensive. You build a bunch more homes, and this is actually what Canada used to do in the 1970s. You just sort of had, tax structures and various other means to build your way out of an affordability crisis. We don't really have that in Canada for any number of reasons, zoning laws being the most prominent. So Vancouver, the most unaffordable housing market in the entire country. If you look at a map of Vancouver, more than 80% of it is only zoned for single family homes or duplexes. So basically, in most of Vancouver, you go to jail if you build anything denser than a house. So yeah, when you create conditions like that, it's almost inevitable you're going to have a shortage of homes followed by spikes in price.
So I guess the big question here is what is stopping officials from changing these laws?
It's sort of political inertia. Basically, everybody, it's the most insidious contributor to housing unaffordability. And there's a number of them, but this is the most prominent one. Because I think a lot of people secretly like it. So I know any number of people, I live on the west coast of Canada, who say, I want affordable cities, I want affordable housing. But then the minute someone looks to build something next door to them that maybe they don't like, seems a bit too tall, might block out the sun, then they go to the barricades to get it shut down, not realizing that it's exactly thousands of little actions like that that stop us from building the homes we need at the price points we need. So yeah, I think it's government policies that just do not support the increase in supply, and lots of people who quietly support those policies. Potentially because, if you bought a house in 1980 in Vancouver for $86,000 in East Vancouver, now it's worth $1.4 million. So maybe you quietly like the policy that essentially allowed you to win the lottery.
And I guess, what are the demographics of these Canadians that actually do own their own properties?
Well, it's going to skew older because basically we've been on an upward trend for about the last 20 to 30 years in some markets. I mean, some changes here and there. So yeah, I think there's a huge generational divide here because anybody who owned a home prior to 1985 is basically fine. And anybody like me who's in their 30s or 20s has never really known an era. I mean, sure, we have low interest rates, which is another contributor, but has never really known an era in which owning, a viable, reasonable home to raise a family in most major real estate markets is ever going to be within reach.
All right, Mr. Hopper, some really interesting information there. Thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily, sir.
Thank you.
All right, we've got top stories from across the country coming up next as the weekend rain helps BC firefighting efforts. The RCMP investigate a church fire in Alberta, and a statue of Anne Frank is revealed in Edmonton. We'll have these stories and more coming up next on the Forum Daily, so stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back. Weekend showers brought some relief and stalled significant growth at a wildfire that's forced thousands from their homes in BC's southern interior. Forrest Tower, a fire information officer with the BC Wildfire Service, says the weather gave crews an opportunity to attack. They built guards around parts of the White Rock Lake fire burning between Kamloops and Okanagan Lake. But he says the return of hot and dry weather is likely to create conditions for potentially aggressive fire behavior later this week. RCMP are investigating a weekend fire at a church in northern Alberta. They say officers were called to the blaze at the Fox Lake Community Church on Saturday night. Local firefighters doused the flames, but police say the interior of the building was badly damaged. They say a fire investigator has determined that it was deliberately set, and they're asking anyone with information about the incident to call them. A crowd gathered in Edmonton over the weekend for the unveiling of a statue of Anne Frank. It was installed in Light Horse Park as a gift from the Dutch-Canadian Club Edmonton to memorialize the Holocaust and the Canadian military's contribution to liberating Holland during the Second World War. The diary Anne kept while in hiding gained international fame after her death in 1945 at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. The statue is a replica of a work created by Dutch sculptor Peter Daunt in 1960. Some Manitoba businesses say they're keeping their mask mandates in place, even though masks in the province have now gone from required to recommended. Phil Klein, the owner of Bagel Smith, says his shop is small and he wants to err on the side of caution. In Winnipeg's Polo Park Shopping Centre, the rules vary from store to store. Health centers in 8 Nunavut communities are closing temporarily because there aren't enough nurses to staff them. Each of Nunavut's 25 communities has a healthcare center that is staffed by nurses. But the territory only has one hospital in Iqaluit for its 40,000 people. Nunavut's Department of Health says its plans to offer virtual health services, fly-in clinics, and paramedic services to the communities with closures. The territory's health department says it's also working with 11 nursing agencies in Canada to recruit staff to the territory as soon as possible. Ontario's border towns could look a little busier today. The same goes for Toronto's Pearson Airport as Canada welcomes back non-essential American travelers who are fully vaccinated. But the newfound freedom doesn't go both ways. Non-essential Canadian travelers still can't cross land borders into the U.S. regardless of their vaccination status. Even so, business owners in tourist-reliant border communities say they are thrilled with the development. A titan of Ontario politics has died. Former Conservative Premier Bill Davis was 92. He held the position from 1971 to 1985 and was one of Canada's longest-serving and most influential premiers. A statement from his family says Mr. Davis was surrounded by his relatives when he died in Brampton yesterday of natural causes. Condolences and tributes have poured in from the likes of Premier Doug Ford, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Toronto Mayor John Tory, and numerous others from all walks of life. Ontario's daily COVID-19 case count has climbed above 400 for the first time since mid-June. The province reported 423 new COVID cases yesterday. That raised the 7-day rolling average to 261 cases compared to 196 a week earlier. The province also counted 6 new deaths linked to the virus. Health officials in New Brunswick are investigating the source of a Legionnaires' disease outbreak in Moncton. The province declared the outbreak on Friday after 6 cases were reported in 2 weeks. Dr. Yves Liger, the Regional Medical Officer of Health, says his department is trying to find any common exposures among the 6 patients. He says samples have been sent for testing to see whether the bacteria is the same type, which will indicate whether there is a single source for the infections. Housing for people with disabilities was the central issue during a campaign stop by Nova Scotia Liberal leader Ian Rankin, as advocates called for more supports for people with physical and intellectual disabilities. Disability rights advocates say more needs to be done to improve housing and community care supports for people with disabilities. They called on Mr. Rankin to phase out institutional facilities and replace them with small options homes, a key recommendation in a landmark 2013 report referred to as the Roadmap. Nova Scotia's progressive Conservatives are promising a $500 tax credit for people who adopt a dog from a recognized shelter if the party is elected to govern on August 17th. PC leader Tim Houston says dogs provide mental and physical health benefits, and the tax incentive will encourage people to develop healthy routines after a difficult COVID-19 pandemic. Top stories from around the world coming up next as the United States encourages more people to get vaccinated. A COVID-19 pass is required in France, and the UN releases a report on climate change. These stories and more stories from around the world coming up next on the Forum Daily, so stay tuned. We'll be right back after some short messages from our sponsors. Health officials in the U.S. are warning that unless more Americans get vaccinated against COVID-19, cases, hospitalizations, and deaths will continue to soar. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says more than 44,000 people are currently hospitalized with COVID-19, which is nearly 4 times the number in June. About 50% of U.S. residents are fully vaccinated, and more than 70% of adults have received at least 1 dose. People in France are now required to show a QR code proving they have a special virus pass to enjoy restaurants and cafes or travel across the country. The measure is part of a government plan to encourage more people to get the vaccine and to slow down a surge in infections. Over 36 million people in France, or more than 54% of the population, are fully vaccinated. Polls show that most French people support the health pass, but the measure has prompted strong opposition from some people who say their freedoms will be compromised. Starting today, Amazon workers who show up at warehouse jobs must also mask up. The online retail behemoth now requires all warehouse employees to wear masks inside, whether they're vaccinated or not. The new order applies to 900,000 Amazon workers. The move follows steps by a growing number of retailers to cobble together mask and vaccine mandates for workers. A more than 3,000-page report from 234 researchers says global warming is already accelerating sea level rise, shrinking ice, and worsening climate extremes, and all these trends will get worse. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report released this morning says Earth's climate is getting so hot, the temperature limits set in the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement will be surpassed in about a decade. The report says as the planet warms, places will get hit more, not just by extreme weather, but by multiple climate disasters that occur simultaneously. Thoughts and prayers? It seems that Facebook now wants both from its users. The social media giant has launched a new feature where people can ask fellow Facebook users to pray about things like job interviews, illnesses, and other personal issues. Some religious leaders see the Facebook prayer option as a new way to gather the faithful. Others fear it would raise privacy and security concerns. The Taliban have taken another provincial capital in Afghanistan. The council chief of northern Saripol province said on Monday that the Taliban overran the provincial capital. Government forces have now completely withdrawn from the province. The militants have ramped up their push across much of Afghanistan in recent weeks, taking district after district and large swaths of land in the mostly rural countryside. The European Union's foreign policy chief said Monday that Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega has crushed any prospect of free and fair elections in November by arresting dozens of opposition figures. Nicaragua is scheduled to hold national elections on November 7th, and Mr. Ortega is seeking a 4th consecutive term. He placed an opposition vice presidential candidate under house arrest last week. Josep Borrell was further irked by last Friday's decision to strip the last opposition party of its legal status. Authorities in northern Mali say at least 40 people are dead after gunmen attacked a series of villages over the weekend. The violence came after people in the communities had denounced two jihadist leaders. Omar Sis, a local official in the area, says most of the victims were shot in front of their houses, while others were going to the mosque. The latest violence took place in the volatile region along the borders of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, where extremists linked to the Islamic State group are known to be active. Lebanese media say one man was killed during a brawl at a gas station over fuel supplies. The national news agency says the violence erupted on Monday and involved weapons. Severe shortages of fuel have hit the small Mid-East nation, prompting gas station queues and plunging the country, dependent on private generators for power, into long hours of darkness. The shortages are blamed on smuggling, hoarding, and the inability of the cash-strapped government to secure deliveries. Saudi Arabia's Aramco has announced a net income of around $47 billion for the first half of the year. That's double what the oil producer earned in the same period last year when the pandemic grounded travel and pummeled global demand for oil. This puts Aramco back squarely where it was before the pandemic struck and sunk earnings to $23.3 billion at this time last year. An elephant herd that has fascinated locals and people around the world by making a year-long journey to urbanized southwest China, raiding farms, and even a retirement home for food appears finally to be headed home. Local authorities have deployed trucks, workers, and drones to keep the 14 Asian elephants safe and have used food to steer them away from populated areas. Asian elephants are a protected species and number about 300 in China. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website or follow us on social media. We'll see you next time. Take care, Canada.